a go-to-market strategy is based on three things. One, defining your ideal customer profile, or ICP, as we like to say, right? And within that ideal customer profile, have a matching, real, tangible, budgeted pain, a reason to be that lines up to that ICP's every day, right? So it's not a sort of ethereal, like, oh, I could do my job differently. But it's I have a problem doing this, and your messaging to that. So that number one is probably the most important part of a go-to-market plan, because once you have identified that person and problem, then you need to come up with a compelling narrative that speaks to all the people in the buying committee, especially if you're talking about an enterprise piece of software. Who are you really talking to, and what does this product do for them in specific?
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing Podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the E-Marketing Association. I also run an agency, Did It. I own a supplement brand, run a nonprofit in the cause marketing space. So pretty much all things marketing. And that's why I'm super excited to be chatting with Shelli Strand. She's a market strategy and go-to-market advisor that helps founders turn vision into category leadership. Mostly she's working with startups now, but she's worked with enterprise organizations through the years, including some major names. Take a look at her LinkedIn profile for more details. She's really helping folks sharpen positioning and scale what works within the SaaS category. So we'll start with sort of what lessons about marketing you picked up in the hyper-competitive SaaS and security sectors that you think are applicable to other hyper-competitive industries.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Kevin. And I love this question because I think of business to business SaaS as sort of the exquisite pinpoint of how to position and market challenge, right? Because everything can be so the same and competitive. And within that, when you're talking about something like security, which, let's be honest, is frankly something people don't really want to think about or buy, and it's led by brilliant people who are often misunderstood. It's kind of the double black diamond run of marketing. So there's a lot of learning. Two things that I would say to that. One, um, the marketing and positioning of B2B and especially security products can never be broad, or it's not as efficient when it's broad. Um, I've seen so many startups in security talk about how security is an inflection point. Businesses are now tasked with something even larger than they were before. And unfortunately, we keep on saying that. And that's kind of stating the obvious. So the narrative that comes out of that is change the way you do change the way you secure your network, or change the way your incident response team works, or change everything. And there's not a CISO, sorry, a chief security officer in the world who wants a vendor to come along, especially one that is new in the market and not a brand they're familiar with, and tell them that they have to upend everything that they've done and change their job. It doesn't happen. So number one is the number one sort of takeaway from that, which hasn't changed. It's actually only gotten more acute, is don't come in trying to sell something that doesn't fit into an already budgeted and acutely felt problem. And don't suggest that they're going to sort of upend and change everything for your new idea. It has to be something that fits in their workflow. And it has to be something that is needed in their workflow. So that's kind of number one. Number two, and I always say this to my chief marketing officer brethren, as well as my security folks, and the marketing folks are more amenable to it, and the security officers come around to it pretty quickly. Chief security officers and chief marketing officers have a lot in common. Um, I have a lot of shared experiences with CISOs that I've talked to who, their inbox is flooded with, this is a great way to parse data. That's a great way to assess alarms. This is a great way to help your workflow. This is a great way to communicate what your under budgeted and underappreciated group does. Well, that's the same stuff that we hear um, as CMOs in our inbox. So, where you can find empathy with your audience, use it. I would say those are the two biggest things that I've learned over and over again.
Yeah, that certainly can be applied to pretty much any industry. You know, the further something is from something that's known, the harder it is to sell, right? So fitting into, I mean, it's probably more so at the enterprise level. Maybe once you get down into the SMB, something completely new can be a shiny object and you can sell it. But I would imagine that in the industries you're dealing with, which are primarily enterprise level, where they even have a security chief security officer, right? They don't below a certain size, you don't have that. You might have a chief information officer or a chief technical officer, but you wouldn't even have a role necessarily who's in charge of this. So that's
Right.
a great takeaway.
Well, and it's part of that, and I think this has changed a lot with the new large language models. But 10 years ago, every startup in cybersecurity wanted to be a platform because the platform play was the one that was going to be the best funded and the one that would be able to exit much more, you know, richly, either by acquisition, but of course, the brass ring of IPOing. And the fact is that platforms are a whole lot harder to get off the ground. They take a lot more time and a lot more money. And guess what? They always do start with that one thing that the company does really well and expands rather than starts big and then goes big.
So there's obviously the acronym that gets used a lot in SaaS marketing, which is, your go-to-market. What's your GTM? What's your go-to-market strategy? And not everybody understands what the acronym really means, right? And even within the industry, I see that sometimes people have different definitions of how broadly things are encompassed within the go-to-market strategy,
Yeah.
right? Some of them think of it as very tactical, very sales driven, very lead gen driven, and sort of ignore earned media, for example. Others are like, oh no, the go-to-market strategy has to include analysts and PR and digital PR, right? So how do you think it's best for people to think about their go-to-market strategy and how would you define it?
Yeah, that's another great question, and one that gets me out of bed in the morning. This is the part of marketing that makes me excited, because it's so simple yet so very difficult and painful. Really, a go-to-market strategy is based on three things. One, defining your ideal customer profile, or ICP, as we like to say, right? And within that ideal customer profile, have a matching, real, tangible, budgeted um, pain, a reason to be that lines up to that ICP's every day, right? So it's not a sort of ethereal, like, oh, I could do my job differently. But I have a problem doing this, and you're messaging to that. So that number one is probably the most important part of a go-to-market plan, because once you have identified that person and problem, then you need to come up with a compelling narrative that speaks to all the people in the buying committee, especially if you're talking about an enterprise piece of software. Who are you really talking to, and what does this product do for them in specific. And so your narrative has to be it has to have a North Star about what you're doing and the value that you provide to the world, but then it has to be directed specifically to just continuing to use security as an example. The chief information security officer, sure, but what about the chief security architect, the person who's figuring out how to orchestrate everything that they're doing in the security department? Those two people have very different um, conversations points. And gosh, don't you know it? There's a lot of times that the CEO of a company will be in a buying decision for a big purchase in cybersecurity. So, how do you talk about what your product does for him or her? And then taking these two things as your sort of scaffolding, how do you become repeatable and scalable? How do you set up an orchestration with different channels to make sure that not just your marketing, but your sales and your customer success and your customer feedback and all of those things are in a very tight loop so that you can optimize as you go.
So one thing I'd love to add on to that question is, cybersecurity in many lenses, right, is sort of similar to other kinds of insurance in
Oh,
that you sort of know that you need it, but you hope you never actually have to use it. But the difference with cybersecurity is, the platforms I would imagine they're more easily able to communicate their value are the ones that are showing you what they're doing along the way, right? So
yeah.
something that filters spam out of my inbox, for example, okay, I either have the choice of getting the spam and dealing with it, or I have a nice filter that filters out the malware and does also spam filtering. But unless it's telling me exactly how much it's doing, I really can't. I don't have a KPI for value, right?
Right.
So unlike health insurance or auto insurance, where you sort of know bad things could happen and I need to be prepared for them, the security area has that element, but at the same time, there's ongoing threats and there's ongoing KPIs. So how do the platforms that you've worked with, how do they use that sort of constant threat in relationship to the tidal wave threat that happens much less frequently, which is a domain of service domain of service attack or whatever, some other big security event. How do you translate the sort of real-time day-to-day KPIs into the pain points that people take action on?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and you sort of tip the hat to the answer in your question. That's exactly what you do. You take the big ideas and you put them into daily KPIs. And really, the best way to actually get your hands around this as a marketing and communications executive is to team, um, hopefully in reality, but a lot of times virtually, if you will, about what you know about chief security officers, but team with them because guess what? That chief information security officer has the very difficult job of messaging exactly that every day for their existence for the seat at the executive table, right? And again, I'll draw this comparison just like a chief marketing officer. If a chief marketing officer is unable to show how daily KPIs translate into the big picture of growing the market share for a company, then they lose their seat at the table. That's when you see CMOs turn into VPs of marketing and reporting under the chief sales officer, or the office of the CMO just goes away completely and it turns into a PR group with a dedicated field marketing team or something of that sort. Well, that happens with security officers too. If they can't talk about their strategic value in a way that is tangible, they get put under the CIO. And another thing is they do on a daily basis work to figure out how the reality is those big tidal wave attacks are something that come from a phishing email or something small. I mean, the tidal wave comes from tiny things. It's the butterfly wing or whatever, the butterfly wing of security. And so help them communicate that, and you'll be helping communicate your own product too.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things that I find interesting about your sector or the security sector, but also other IT and SaaS related sectors, is a sort of resurgence post-pandemic of events, right?
Yes.
You would think like it's a piece of software. Like I don't need to
Yeah.
shake the person's hand. I don't need to be having cocktails with this person. I don't need to be demoing them in front of me at a booth. Like I could just do it via Zoom or Teams or Google or whatever platform I would typically want to use. But yet, events are extremely prevalent within these industries. People are getting together. Gigantic booths are being erected, whether it's CES, which is a general show that has a little sector, or specific security conferences and shows. It seems like they're back and almost bigger than ever.
Yeah. And
So, what are when you invest in a show, like when you say, okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a booth and we're going to have a presence, we're going to have activations, like what are your cohorts in the industry miss that they should be doing when they
yeah.
choose to go to shows?
Oh, I love that. A couple things, having a long career before COVID and then going through COVID, it was so interesting. Uh, I personally, I'm happy about this turn of events because, not COVID, obviously. I'm happy about the resurgence and I think kind of re-health, how would I say that? Revitalization of events is a really positive thing, not just for the industry, but also as just a point on the map of humanity wants to get together. We want to see each other. And I'm happy for that. I saw giant, I mean, good Lord, Microsoft turned their entire events group into a TV station and they did a great job. But it was kind of like, we still kind of want to get together. So that was good. Um, I think it was a valuable shakeup too. Before times, we were all going through the motions. And to your specific question, what can be done wrong with events? Marketers, and I'll put myself in the category of having made this mistake, would put together an event and stop the ROI and measurement at how many people showed up. And that was always just a sort of a vanity. Um, and and a lot of, I mean, to be honest, a lot of early stage founders needed the vanity for both their own whatever, and that's fine, but also for funding conversations and big customers having a confidence in them being around. But the missed opportunity is, how do you get past just the metric of how many people showed up and engaged with you? How do you orchestrate with your sales team, with your pre-sales team, and your customer success folks to kind of work as many people through the funnel, if not just to sort of weed them out and kind of come up with the gold in the pan, but just to make the most out of the event. And I think we the shakeup did a good job in creating I think more bespoke events and more bespoke experiences at larger events that are much more intentional than we used to be. I think it's been actually kind of a good cleansing, and I'm glad they're back. I'll say it. A lot of people are like, "Oh, I hate events." I'm like, "Do you really? Do you really?"
Do you see events as primarily demand generation, or you see them also for sort of demand harvesting and competitive conquest?
So that's so interesting. In security, there security lives by three events, maybe two now, in reality. The RSA conference in San Francisco, the Black Hat conference in Las Vegas, and then there's some smattering of sort of Gartners in there, and there's some other uh, events that you sort of have to be at to do the competitive conquest. And there's always this sort of Game of Thrones jockeying for who's going to be next to what booth, and oh my God, our big competitor just like landed across the street from us, and that was kind of a good thing. Like if you're a tiny startup and CrowdStrike moved in across the street from you, it's like you're kind of getting a little bit of a cred, right? Um, but the my conversations with founders, CEOs, and CROs were always it's both when you're small, and you have to decide when to do both well, um, because what you don't want to do is something small and sort of half, just to be there. If you can't afford to make it an experience that people remember you as somebody who is put together, right? You can't just
Yeah.
sort of get a table at RSA and hope that that helped you with your brand building. It's not. I mean, it might be better for you. A good friends of mine, Red Canary in Colorado, they used to not buy any space. Like they have the giant beautiful booths now, but before they used to just walk around with backpacks and their amazing t-shirts. And they did that for years. They held out on getting space until they could afford to actually do it right. And I have to say they really, really did a good job with that. Um,
Yeah, for sure. One of the things
yeah,
that I also noticed is that when folks do events, not only do they live and die just based on who shows up, but they sort of forget all the earned media opportunities that occur, all the social media activations, all the assets that can be created while you're at the event that then can serve the sales team for the next 6 months to 12 months. And, so having come up through search, right, where organic search visibility had a bunch of factors that went into it about, you know, backlinks and all the things about, having the right content on your site and even having the right content on other sites, which was sort of back used to be called Barnacle SEO. Those are now all factoring into GEO, right? And I feel like a lot of event teams are failing to use the events as content creation and content syndication opportunities, right?
that's so cool.
Because
Love that.
yeah, because the face to face obviously has the benefit of trust building, right? Which you sort of alluded to, which is a lot easier to build trust if you have a presence somewhere, because then people are like, okay, they're well enough funded that they got the booth, or at least some sort of fun, team walking around with t-shirts and
Yeah,
backpacks. But
yeah,
the a person in a square on a screen, are they, how real are they in comparison to somebody you meet face to face, right? So from a trust building perspective, that's really great. But then, these conversations that are had, people are forgetting that some of them, especially, on-site face-to-face testimonials with your top customers and content creation at a show, when people are in fact face-to-face, you know, repurpose that, right? Get it out there as many places as possible because that's going to get ingested by the LMs right alongside your Capterra and G2 and all your other, independently verified uh, information sources that talk about how great you are as a platform, right? And what you do and what you do well. So, show producers similarly, there's a mistake they make all the time, which is they take down last year's show. They
yes,
don't use the assets either. It's actually typical that they don't just create a subdirectory and move the speaker list and the
right.
videos of the speakers and whatever was publicly available. That it just sort of gets wiped out. It's 6 months later when they launch the next year's show site. Usually the previous show site's gone,
They
right?
make
So they
sure.
don't even take full advantage
Yeah,
of all the work that they put into getting an amazing speaker lineup and then synopses of what the speaker said, right, which of course would be easier to create now than ever, right? You could take the video transcript and feed it into your favorite LLM and get a summary and then have a human wordsmith it. And I just feel like there's so many people in the events industry, because they tend to be so siloed as their own groups within marketing,
sure.
right? They're not thinking big picture, like what else should I be doing, right, with this content and with these people that I get to see face to face.
So
So
true.
it's been I will see how many people hear this message over the next couple of years and start to think more holistically about events from a content value perspective.
Absolutely. And Kevin, you and I were talking a couple weeks ago about demand, and you brought up a really great term, I think, that I'm still really curious about. You talked about demand harvesting versus demand creation or demand generation. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you define demand harvesting, because I think it's really it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I think about it as hand raising of some sort or another, right? Um, and we don't know necessarily what stimulus resulted in now there is demand, right? But once there's the demand, once the person is feeling the pain and wants to solve a problem, or they might even be a little step above that and they're starting to really research a little bit more about that, right? A little bit more about malware in email versus malware in other sources, et cetera, in Slack channels, whatever. So, they're just starting to research that. But every time they start to research that, they would typically in the past use Google or Bing, right? That was where they would go to get that question answered, to do additional research, to find solutions to that problem. Increasingly, particularly in the technical space, they're moving to ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and Perplexity. So, but the one commonality there is they're raising their hand and they're saying,
Yeah.
"I have a problem." So if a marketer intersects with that instant in time, they're not really doing demand gen, right? The demand is there, right? And it could have been stimulated by anybody's marketing within the entire industry, right?
Yeah.
Somebody could have done an ad, CrowdStrike could have done a campaign that got a person interested in something. So they went to Google and they started to research it. And then they saw CrowdStrike's competitor. And because CrowdStrike's competitor was either more organically visible or had a really good paid search ad, that demand that was generated as a result of this piece of PR or advertising or a conference ends up manifesting and getting harvested by somebody else, right? So I always say, when you're starting to think through your marketing budget, marketing allocation, it's just a lot easier to convert a click or an in-person meeting or whatever when there's demand that's ready to be harvested in comparison to demand gen. Because demand gen means I need to be educated, then I need to be told how much pain I'm feeling, then I have to say, don't shoot the messenger. I just told you about the pain. It's not my fault, but I can help you solve it, right? So there's all sorts of a choreography and a dance that has to happen with demand gen, whereas demand harvesting, if there's somebody looking and you're not there, that was a huge opportunity cost. It almost doesn't matter what caused the pain or what caused the demand to suddenly manifest within a Google, within a Bing, within a ChatGPT or a Perplexity, right? You want to try to be there because demand harvesting is always the easiest because the person's feeling the pain right there. So the next step up from demand harvesting might be sort of competitive conquest, where maybe I don't feel like my current solution is meeting the need, right? So I'm not quite at demand harvesting stage of signal that I'm giving off as an individual or a part of a buying team, right? Because of course with ABM, as you pointed out, there could be lots of influencers, but there could be a really important person who's identified their own pain and it ends up becoming enterprise level pain if they bring it up to everybody else. And so that I tend to think about sort of this balance between demand harvesting and demand gen because you end up reaching it, you run out of inventory on demand harvesting, right? So only a certain number of people are raising their hand saying, I really want to be able to protect my company against malware and I want to have a technical solution, but I also want an HR solution that trains people to identify phishing email more effectively, right? And so they're in this research stage, but eventually you'll run out of those people that are organically there. And that's where you have to sort of move to the middle funnel and the upper funnel and do demand gen. And you just have to make sure that you have your own harvesting system in place. Because the worst thing that would be possible for the CrowdStrike CMO is for them to go out and do a lot of top funnel, maybe buy a Super Bowl ad, do something gigantic and big, right?
Great
Get
example.
get huge amounts of visibility, and then everybody gets curious and they don't use the word CrowdStrike in their search. And then all of a sudden, all their competitors are starting to show up in Google and Bing and ChatGPT, Perplexity, et cetera, right? So, I always like to put all the ducks in a row on demand harvesting before hitting the gas on demand gen, because the last thing you want to be doing is industry-wide sector level demand gen, which you don't get to take a benefit of, right?
Mhm.
We actually used to when we ran AT&T Wireless's paid search, we used to pay attention to see when Verizon would do a Yahoo homepage takeover, which was tonnage, right? Because it would stimulate searches on all the various mobile related search terms from specific phone models to whatever. So this was somebody else creating the demand, and we would see a surge in demand that we could then harvest, right? So we would look every morning at like 6 a.m. to see if there was a homepage takeover and then make sure we were more aggressive in the advertising on paid search to be able to be there when the people engaged in the search behavior because the stimulus was one marketer's advertising and then you wanted to be there to harvest it. So having come originally from brand marketing, which is really just all about education and awareness and propensity to buy and are you in the consideration set or not, that's all great, right? But if in these days where people are relying on electronic research means to decide who's in the consideration set, right? You just want to make sure that you're there and you make the best possible impression,
Mhm.
both pun intended, right? Because it's a search impression or display impression, whatever. And I mean, apropos to the conversation, ChatGPT just announced recently, I think this week, that they're going to start selling advertising, but they
Yeah.
haven't given a whole lot of detail around it. But similar to search, there'll be a lot of intent potentially packed into that individual query. My particular opinion on that is ChatGPT is in an opportunity to, in a privacy safe way, use more not just that single query, but more things that it knows about you in a privacy safe way to delight you with a relevant ad, right? Whether you're a B2B searcher or not. Because the more a platform knows about you, the more effectively it can plant a sponsored link in front of you, a sponsored ad or whatever. And finding that balance between privacy safe and delighting the searcher with the relevant ad, right? Finding that balance is key for Google, for Bing, and for all the chatbots as well.
Wow. And are we at a place now with LLMs that you've figured out a way to orchestrate that harvesting? I mean, I'm super curious how that actually works. I mean, how do you do that?
Well,
That
paid search is the easiest way, right? Because you can basically, as long as you have relevant landing pages and you're relevant, you can go ahead and buy your way in as long as you're willing to elbow everybody else who also wants that visibility out of the way. So you have to have the most efficient entire enterprise, right? Because everything in sort of a compound marketing way factors into your ability to afford a click for a highly valuable search term, right? So the only way you can afford that click is if you have a compelling offer, great landing page with a great, that pays out that offer, gets the conversion, and of course, you're retargeting and getting those people later on as well. But then you have to have a sales team that's really on their game, right, and is actually converting as many of those leads as possible. And then you have to have the highest LTV. All that stuff factors into your ability to afford the ad, right? So in the short term, what happens is when you get venture funding or you go public, they're like, well, we actually don't have all that crap solved
yeah,
yet.
yeah.
So we'll just temporarily go out and aggressively buy the clicks, which will turn into the leads, and we'll fix the engine later, right? And
Leads.
hopefully you do,
Yeah,
right?
Franken leads. Yeah.
Right. Because the sales team screaming for leads, you know, longer term on the paid side of search, what you really want to be doing is figuring out how to cherry pick your aggressiveness and your bidding to the highest LTV customers only,
That's right.
right? Because you don't really want leads for the sales team that either don't convert or don't convert into long-term revenue and profit value, right? And that nuance of understanding is what makes B2B to some extent much more fascinating for search marketing teams is because you have to impute all the things that go into the likelihood that a person is more valuable who's engaging in a search in San Francisco on a Tuesday at noon than somebody in Boise, Idaho at 3 a.m.
Right.
Identical search term, right? But you need to understand the nuances of does that predict value? If that person in Boise, Idaho, works for Warren Buffett, then that changes the game, doesn't it? Right. So certain people in certain places are more valuable. So on the organic side, it was all about SEO. Since Did It was founded, we were doing SEO before Google was it around. And so SEO remained a big part of that. But now there's this scenario where you have Google starting to push down organic results and put the AI results there. And then, of course, you've got people abandoning Google to go engage in Perplexity or Claude or ChatGPT. So you need to understand GEO, right? And GEO is much more holistic as far as how you have to plan your campaigns because it includes digital PR and social media, content creation and co-creation. All those things are fed into the LLMs and help convince the LLMs that you are, in fact, either individually or as a company, an authority or a solution for a problem, right? Because it's all probabilistic. So, unless there's a consensus that a particular platform is good at something, the LLM will not mention it, right? There needs to be consensus. How do you get consensus? Well, marketing. Everybody needs to agree because they read a
Yeah.
lot of content and there is a lot of content.
When you are consistent and precise, right? If because it all goes back to we both come from brand marketing. It all comes back to a real and tangible customer who has a real and tangible problem now that you say something to over and over about your value, aka your narrative, and you say it the same way, whether it's the salesperson saying it, the CEO saying it, the finance officer saying it, or the marketing person saying it. And that consistency is sort of what gives you the dye in the water that stays the same color as it expands to all these different places. Otherwise, GEO and search and all that stuff just doesn't, you're not, you haven't formed context because you haven't gotten consistency or consensus.
Yeah, for sure. And the tightly defined ICP is sort of the North Star for that, right? Because, now you can put yourself in that person's role, either just mentally or talk to 100 of them, right? And understand all the problems that they face and the different ways they articulate those problems, because they're not going to use the identical language to describe their problems and what's top of mind for them. But if you talk to enough of them and you do a good enough job anticipating and imputing what they're interested in, that can guide your editorial calendar. And your editorial calendar, of course, then gets stuff syndicated out. The LMs adjust it, and then eventually you'll find yourself more visible. So, crazily enough, right now, at least for the time being, most of the LLMs don't distinguish between influencer content, branded content, pure editorial content, etc.
We're like babies again for a couple minutes before it's
So
all
because of that, though, that has really interesting implications.
yeah,
Because if you were considering using B2B influencer marketing or
yeah.
analyst-faced marketing through one of these analyst companies, right? And you're on the fence between doing it or not, and you're looking at the KPIs they can demonstrably bring to the table, like, oh yeah, we'll put out this quadrant into the following decision makers, and therefore you should pay all this money to be in the study, or we'll do this chief information officer magazine security segment or issue, and you can be in that, and we'll email it out, blah blah blah. Right. So if you look at that just in a silo, you might be on the fence about doing it as a marketer, right? But then when you start to think about it more holistically, you might be, well, I'd like to have it out there because they might rank organically themselves, right? Chief Information Officer magazine, that piece of content, if it's branded content, might get crawled, might get indexed, and then you'll be there. So you're almost there, but you're not there with your domain. You're there because you have something that was written somewhere else.
Yeah.
Sometimes certain
Well,
publishers will actually no index their branded content, others will. So asking those kinds of questions becomes important because if they no index the branded content, then you won't get GEO benefit out of it either, right?
yeah.
And that's so it's at influencers. I don't know what your perspective is on influencers, B2B influencers, but that's an area that I hear bandied about now as to whether or not the B2B influencer has a place in the marketing plan. What's your thought on that?
I wish I could firmly say no, but I shouldn't say that. You know, things change. Like this is when I start feeling like I'm sounding like, get off my lawn. Things are different. But things change, and when things change, And when sort of the calcified, expensive ways of communicating get displaced by that change, it's a good thing. Um, Influencers are in so many ways a really accessible way of communicating these days. Of course, accessible and less expensive things are volatile, right? And there's a whole new thing to manage there. So I'm fascinated to sort of watch the evolution of this. Um, I love the fact that what you were just talking about, how the sort of calcified Gartners, sorry, and Forrester, finally there's a new way of hearing voices that are experts and that are being amplified in sort of an organic, semi-natural way, if you will, that doesn't require the bent knee to the, giant subscription plan, which I've paid many times from a tiny startup budget. So, uh, I, I think it's all a very, very interesting way. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying before. How about if we think about everything with an open mind? And if you kind of make events an allegory for the whole act of marketing, think of all of it as an event. You maybe everybody's sitting behind their computer, maybe everybody's at a booth or at a steak dinner. How are you treating and talking to people in all of those situations, and what are you saying? And that's still what it comes down to.
Yeah, that's great advice because it can be applied sort of the person-to-person communication and the person to group conversation, if you sort of put it through that lens. Anything else that you think marketers should be thinking about this year as they plan their 2026?
No, I think now more than ever, just stay curious and get in and do your travel planning or write your memoir or do something on LLMs. Try a whole bunch of different ones because it's the new language of technology. I mean, I was talking to a founder last night who said, I developed a new what our new feature in 3 hours, and my development team was, saying it was going to be 4 months and three agile teams and so on and so forth. And it's just so important to get fluent on these technologies um, and understand them because it's moving very fast. And there's lots of opportunities that people can take advantage of and optimize, and there's a lot of opportunities people can miss. So,
A bonus question just flew into my head, right? Because when you mentioned that the founder had essentially vibe coded a
yep,
feature very rapidly,
exactly what he said.
a lot of the SaaS companies for the last, 20 years plus,
Yes.
have relied on technology as their moat,
Yeah.
right? And when you can have a small, nimble team of coders, pair coding with their favorite LLM, right? They can develop things at 20x speed. When I looked at my last year, it went to from 4x to 10x to now 20x speed, and that's just mind blowing. In particular, from the perspective of as a C-suite member in a SaaS company of any kind, right? You used to rely on your technology and the product team as your moat, right? Like you had it and nobody else did.
Right.
So, what are the implications from a marketing perspective when you may not be able to rely on um, a feature set as a moat, right? And the sort of where the tech debt almost becomes bigger than the tech value because somebody else can come in there potentially and disintermediate a platform.
I mean, that is the big question. I mean, is our apps going away? Is right? I mean, what does that look like? Two things come to mind, and I'll use for this example. marketing technology. So I've a couple of days ago, I was speaking to a friend of mine who is has a great piece of technology, vibe coded, for doing exactly what we were talking about in the beginning of this call, for doing ICP identification and narrative and sort of brand asset management. And he's finding that the the AI component of it makes faster things that were already very pedantic in the old days, where we would do, the executive workshops and all those things to sort of define the company. Um, but his services are still needed on the other end to sort of curate out the hallucinations, to sort of test, uh, pressure test the testing plan for the go to market and those kinds of things. So he's been able to build a moat, not from what he has vibe coded, but from the services that he can apply at the end of it, or in the process of it. Um, and the pre-work is just a lot faster. That's really cool. The other thing too is, and this is the big race, is the data grab. Like, how much can you get? How much data can you get? Anonymized, but to create data value before your tiny, tiny moat is gone, which might be like 3 months. I mean, and I think maybe services have something to do with that. I don't know. I'm kind of seeing that in the world of marketing. Who knows if it applies to other things? Maybe it'll apply to cybersecurity too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a potential existential moment for SaaS software almost, right? Is sort
Yeah.
of what does the next 2 years look like? Um, so we'll let the VCs figure it out because they're the ones who have to decide whether or not to invest in the ones who are the disintermediators, or whether those are going to get further disintermediated and eliminated.
It goes all back to basics again. Who has the most energetic and tenacious founders? Who has the best teams? Um, venture is looking at the same thing they always have. How do we turn over money fastest for our LPs? And it kind of goes back to basics, because yeah, you're right. There isn't a technology moat. Um, it's really fascinating.
Well, thanks for sharing all your wisdom. It was a great conversation. Look forward to doing it again in the future when everything has changed again.
Yes, exactly, in 5 minutes. It's super good talking to you, Kevin. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Shelly.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in the Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.